There are faces that fade with time, and then there are faces that burn into the memory of the world. His image hangs on walls in cities he never walked through. His name is whispered in protests, painted on banners, stitched into flags. He became more than a man. He became a symbol, a ghost, a myth. But before the myth, there was a boy who loved to read. Before the revolution, there was a young doctor who could not look away from suffering. Before the icon, there was a soul that believed the world could be remade. His name was Ernesto. The world would come to know him as Che. And tonight, as the world around you softens into stillness, let us walk quietly through the story of a life that refused to stay still. A life that crossed borders, climbed mountains, and chased a dream that would never let him rest. This is not a story of perfection. It is a story of conviction, of fire, of hope, and of the weight that comes with wanting to change everything. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too. A gentle tap on subscribe, a quiet press of the bell, and you'll drift through history with us, night after night. No rush, just stories, just stillness. Just you and the past meeting softly in the dark. There are childhoods that pass like gentle rivers, slow and predictable, carrying their children safely toward adulthood. And then there are childhoods that feel like storms, unpredictable and fierce, shaping the child into something harder, something more awake. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was born on June 14, 1928, in Rosario, Argentina, into a world that would never quite let him rest. His first breath came easy, but the ones that followed would teach him what it meant to fight just to stay alive. He was only 2 years old when the asthma found him. It came without warning, a tightness in the chest that turned breathing into labor. One moment he was a toddler playing in the summer air, and the next he was gasping, his small body betraying him, his lungs refusing the very thing they were made to do. His mother, Celia, held him through those first attacks, her own heart breaking as she watched her son struggle for air. She did not panic. She did not collapse. She became his anchor. She learned every remedy, every trick, every way to ease his suffering. She moved the family to the drier climate of Alta Gracia, hoping the air there would be kinder to his lungs. And at night, when the attacks came and the world felt too heavy, she sat beside his bed and read to him. She read him poetry. She read him adventure stories. She read him tales of heroes and rebels, of men and women who refused to accept the world as it was. And Ernesto, lying there in the dark, his chest still tight, his breath still shallow, listened. He absorbed every word. He traveled through those stories when his body would not let him travel anywhere else. And in those quiet hours, something began to take root inside him. A stubbornness, a refusal, a quiet, burning belief that weakness did not have to mean surrender. His father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, was a dreamer and a builder, a man who loved big ideas and took big risks. He tried his hand at various businesses, some successful, many not. The family was never poor, but they were never quite stable either. They moved often. They borrowed. They adapted. And through it all, they talked. The Guevara household was loud with conversation, thick with debate. Politics, philosophy, literature, nothing was off limits. Celia and Ernesto Lynch were both progressives, both sympathetic to leftist ideas, both convinced that the world could be better than it was. They did not shelter their children from hard truths. They did not soften the world for them. And so young Ernesto grew up hearing about injustice, about inequality, about the Spanish Civil War and the rise of fascism. He grew up knowing that the world was not neutral, that it took sides, and that silence was a side too. But he was not a solemn child. He was mischievous. He was stubborn. He was fiercely competitive. The asthma tried to cage him, but he refused the cage. He played soccer even when his lungs screamed at him to stop. He climbed trees. He roughhoused with his siblings. He pushed his body past every limit it tried to set, as if daring it to break him. And sometimes it did. Sometimes the attacks were so severe that he would spend days in bed, pale and exhausted, his mother watching over him with quiet fear. But he always came back. He always got up. And the other children learned not to underestimate him. He might wheeze, he might struggle, but he did not quit. School was a regular for him. The asthma kept him home often, so Celia became his teacher. She was educated, well-read, passionate about learning. She taught him literature, history, languages. She taught him to think critically, to question authority, to never accept an answer just because someone older or richer had given it. And Ernesto devoured it all. He read voraciously, sometimes finishing entire books in a single night. He read Marx and Engels, Freud and Sartre, poetry and philosophy and political theory. By the time he was a teenager, he had read more than most adults ever would. And he carried that knowledge quietly, not as a weapon, but as a lens. It changed how he saw the world. It made him restless. And so, as the night deepens and the story of the boy begins to blur into the story of the man, we pause here. We let the image settle. A young Ernesto, lying in bed, a book open on his chest, his breathing finally steady, his mind already somewhere far away. He does not know yet what he will become. He does not know the mountains waiting for him, the wars, the revolutions, the myth. He only knows that he is alive, that he survived another day, and that tomorrow he will push himself again. Adolescence arrived like a second war. His body, which had already been a battleground, now became a puzzle of contradictions. He was tall and lanky, all sharp angles and restless energy. His face was handsome in an unpolished way, his eyes dark and observant, always watching, always calculating. But the asthma had not loosened its grip. If anything, it had learned to live alongside him, a constant companion that flared without pattern or mercy. He carried an inhaler everywhere. He learned to read the signs in his own chest, the tightening that came before the attack, the warnings his body gave him that most people never had to hear. And still, he refused to live small. He played rugby. It was a strange choice for someone whose lungs could betray him mid-game, but Ernesto was drawn to the roughness of it, the physicality, the way it demanded everything from him. His teammates called him Fuser, a nickname born from his mother's maiden name de la Serna, twisted and shortened the way young men do with language. He played with a recklessness that bordered on self-destruction, throwing himself into tackles, running until his chest screamed, collapsing on the sidelines to gulp air from his inhaler before staggering back onto the field. His coaches did not understand him. His opponents did not know what to make of him, but his teammates respected him because he never asked for mercy. He never used his condition as an excuse. He simply fought harder than anyone else had to. At home, the conversations grew more intense. The world beyond Argentina was tearing itself apart. World War II had ended, leaving behind a new order, a new map, new empires rising where old ones had fallen. The Soviet Union and the United States circled each other like wolves, and every nation in between had to choose a side or pretend neutrality while choosing anyway. In Argentina, politics were a blood sport. Juan Perón had risen to power, a populist who spoke to the working class, who promised dignity and justice and nationalism. Celia and Ernesto Lynch were skeptical. They saw authoritarianism wrapped in the language of liberation. They saw crowds cheering for a man who might betray them. And young Ernesto listened. He did not join the debates as fiercely as he once had. He listened more than he spoke now. He was learning to think in longer arcs, to see patterns instead of just events. He began keeping a journal. It was nothing formal, just a notebook where he scribbled thoughts, observations, fragments of ideas that came to him late at night. He wrote about what he read, about what he saw on the streets, about the beggars and the businessmen, the workers and the idle rich. He wrote about his own body, his own frustrations, the way the asthma made him feel like a prisoner in his own skin. But he also wrote about freedom. Not just political freedom, though that mattered, but personal freedom. The freedom to become something more than what the world expected. The freedom to choose a life that meant something. When it came time to decide on a future, he chose medicine. It was a practical choice in some ways. His mother had nursed him through so many attacks that he had seen firsthand what medicine could do, how it could ease suffering, how it could give someone back their breath, their life. But it was also a moral choice. He did not want to be a doctor who treated the wealthy in comfortable clinics. He wanted to work with the poor, the forgotten, the people who suffered not just from disease, but from the systems that made disease inevitable. He enrolled at the University of Buenos Aires in 1947, and he threw himself into his studies with the same intensity he brought to everything else. Medical school was rigorous, demanding, unforgiving. But Ernesto thrived. He memorized anatomy, studied diseases, learned the language of the body and its breakdowns. He was a good student, disciplined and focused, but he was not obsessed with grades. He was obsessed with understanding. He read beyond the curriculum, diving into texts on public health, on tropical diseases, on the social conditions that created epidemics. He began to see that illness was not just biological. It was political. It was economic. A child died of malnutrition not because medicine failed, but because society failed. A worker contracted tuberculosis not because of bad luck, but because of bad wages, bad housing, bad air. And the more he learned, the angrier he became. But he did not let the anger consume him, not yet. He still laughed. He still went out with friends, drank wine, argued about soccer and literature and women. He fell in love, briefly, clumsily, the way young men do when they are still learning what love means. He traveled when he could, taking short trips around Argentina, visiting family in the provinces, seeing the country beyond Buenos Aires, and everywhere he went, he saw the same thing. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. Poverty spreading like a stain. Indigenous communities pushed to the margins, their land stolen, their cultures erased. And the doctors, the lawyers, the politicians, all pretending not to see. He began to realize that he could not just be a doctor. Or rather, that being a doctor meant more than just treating symptoms. It meant confronting the disease at its root. And the root was not in the body, it was in the world. It was in the way power was distributed, the way resources were hoarded, the way some lives were valued and others were not. He did not have a plan yet. He did not have an ideology fully formed. But he had a question that would follow him for the rest of his life. How do you heal a world that is built on suffering? And so the boy who could not breathe became a young man who could not look away. The asthma still woke him at night. The inhaler still lived in his pocket. But something else lived in him now too, a restlessness, a hunger, a need to see more, to know more, to do more. He was 23 years old. He had one more year of medical school. And then he decided he would leave. He would take a journey. He would see the continent. He would find out what kind of man he was capable of becoming. The night holds him here for a moment, suspended between who he was and who he would be. The books are stacked beside his bed. The journal is open. The inhaler rests on the nightstand. And somewhere in the distance, a motorcycle engine waits to roar. The idea came to him like a fever dream, half-formed and irresistible. He would take a break from medical school, just a pause, just long enough to see the world beyond textbooks and lecture halls. He would travel across South America, not as a tourist, but as a witness, as a student of life itself. He had a friend, Alberto Granado, a biochemist 6 years older, wiry and adventurous, and just reckless enough to say yes to something impossible. They would go together. They would ride a motorcycle, an old Norton 500 that Alberto had somehow kept alive through sheer stubbornness and spare parts. They called it La Poderosa, the mighty one. It was a joke and a prayer all at once. Ernesto's parents did not try to stop him. Celia understood her son too well. She knew that he carried something inside him that could not be contained, a hunger that no amount of studying or security could satisfy. She packed his bag with medicines for his asthma, with warm clothes, with the quiet worry that mothers carry when their children walk toward horizons they cannot see. His father shook his hand, looked him in the eye, and said nothing that needed to be said aloud. They both knew this was not just a trip, it was a threshold. And Ernesto was stepping over it. On December 29th, 1951, they left. Two young men, one aging motorcycle, and the entire spine of a continent stretched out before them. They had almost no money. They had no real itinerary. They had only the road and the belief that the road would teach them what they needed to know. The first days were pure joy, the kind of freedom that feels like flight. The wind against their faces, the landscape unrolling like a promise, the nights spent under stars so thick they seemed close enough to touch. They laughed at everything. They laughed at the motorcycle when it sputtered and died. They laughed at themselves when they got lost. They laughed because they were young and alive and the world was enormous. But the laughter did not last. Not because the joy ended, but because it deepened into something more complicated, something harder to name. As they moved north through Argentina and into Chile, the landscape changed. The cities gave way to villages. The villages gave way to settlements so small they barely had names. And everywhere, the poverty was undeniable. It was not the poverty of postcards or statistics. It was the poverty of faces, of children with swollen bellies and empty eyes, of mothers who aged too fast, of men whose bodies had been used up by mines and fields and factories, their hands gnarled, their backs bent, their futures already written in scars. Ernesto, the medical student, found himself treating people along the way. Word would spread in a village that a doctor was passing through, and they would come to him. They came with infections that had festered for months. They came with broken bones that had healed crooked because no one had set them. They came with diseases that had names in textbooks but no cures in places like this. He did what he could. He cleaned wounds. He gave advice. He dispensed the few medicines he carried. But it was never enough. It was never even close to enough. And the helplessness he felt was not just medical. It was moral. Because he could see that these people were not sick by accident. They were sick by design. In the copper mines of Chuquicamata, Chile, he saw men working in conditions that stripped them of their humanity. They descended into the earth every day, breathing dust and poison, their lungs slowly turning to stone, their bodies breaking down piece by piece so that someone far away could profit. They lived in company towns where everything was owned by the mine, where they were paid in scrip that could only be spent in company stores, where their entire lives were controlled by forces they could not see and could not fight. Ernesto walked through those camps and felt something crack open inside him. This was not poverty. This was theft. This was violence dressed up as economics. He wrote in his journal at night, his handwriting tight and urgent. He wrote about what he had seen, but also about what it meant. He wrote about the indigenous people of the Andes, whose land had been taken, whose languages were being erased, whose existence was treated as an inconvenience by governments that claimed to represent them. He wrote about the way borders divided people who shared the same suffering, the same exploitation, the same enemy. He wrote about how the rich in Buenos Aires had more in common with the rich in Santiago than either had with the poor in their own countries. And he began to see the world not as a collection of nations, but as a system that required some to suffer so that others could thrive. But he did not yet have the language for revolution. He had anger, yes. He had clarity, yes. But he did not yet know what to do with it. He was still a student, still an observer, still a young man on a motorcycle, trying to make sense of a world that seemed designed to break hearts. And so he kept moving. He and Alberto crossed into Peru, and the landscape became almost mythical. The mountains rose like gods, ancient and indifferent, and the ruins of civilizations whispered from the hillsides. They visited Machu Picchu, and Ernesto stood among the stones, feeling the weight of history, the way entire worlds could rise and fall and leave only ghosts behind. In Lima, they volunteered at a leper colony. It was a place called San Pablo, isolated on the banks of the Amazon, where people with Hansen's disease were sent to live apart from the world. The staff wore gloves when they touched the patients. They kept distance. They treated them as contagious, as untouchable, as less than human. But Ernesto did not wear gloves. He shook their hands. He sat with them. He listened to their stories. He celebrated his 24th birthday there, and the patients threw him a party. Humble and beautiful, and he felt something he had not expected. He felt at home. Not because the place was comfortable, but because the people were real. They had been cast out by society, but they had not stopped being human. They had not stopped hoping, and their dignity in the face of everything humbled him. On the night of his birthday, he did something that became legend among those who knew him. The colony was divided by a river. On one side lived the medical staff, safe and separate. On the other side lived the patients. And that night, Ernesto, despite his asthma, despite the danger, despite every reasonable objection, swam across the river. He swam to the side where the patients lived, to celebrate with them, to refuse the distance that the world insisted upon. It was a small act, a symbolic act, but it was also a choice, a statement, a line crossed. He would not accept the boundaries that separated the sick from the healthy, the poor from the comfortable, the forgotten from the seen. And as he floated in that dark water, his lungs already tightening, his body already protesting, he felt something shift. The observer was becoming a participant. The student was becoming something else. He did not have a name for it yet, but it was growing, and it would not let him rest. The motorcycle carried them onward, coughing and sputtering, holding together through sheer willpower. But Ernesto was no longer the same man who had climbed onto it months before. The journey had changed him. The faces had changed him. The world, in all its cruelty and beauty, had cracked him open. And he could not go back. He could only go forward. La Poderosa finally gave up in Chile. The engine seized, the frame cracked, and no amount of tinkering could resurrect it. The mighty one had carried them as far as it could, and now it lay dead by the roadside like a faithful animal that had simply run out of breath. Ernesto and Alberto stood over it for a moment, not quite sure whether to mourn or laugh. They had known this would happen. Machines, like bodies, have their limits. And so they left it behind and continued on foot, by bus, by hitching rides on trucks that carried fruit or livestock or nothing at all. The journey did not end with the motorcycle. If anything, it deepened. Because now they were truly vulnerable, truly dependent on the kindness of strangers, truly part of the world they were moving through instead of just passing over it. They traveled through Peru, and the poverty they encountered was not just visible, it was visceral. In the mountain villages, children ran barefoot through the cold, their feet cracked and bleeding. In the cities, families lived in shacks made of corrugated metal and cardboard. Whole communities built on land that no one else wanted, land that flooded when it rained and baked when it did not. Ernesto treated people wherever he could, setting up makeshift clinics in town squares, in churchyards, in the corners of markets. He lanced infections, he wrapped wounds, he diagnosed illnesses he had no way to cure. And every patient taught him the same lesson, that suffering was not random, that it had causes, that those causes had names. He met a woman in Cusco, an indigenous woman who had walked 3 days to see him because her daughter was sick. The child had a fever that would not break, a cough that rattled in her small chest. Ernesto examined her and knew immediately what it was: pneumonia, treatable if you had antibiotics, survivable if you had access to a hospital, but this woman had neither. She had walked 3 days because there was no doctor in her village, no clinic, no medicine. And when Ernesto told her what her daughter needed, the woman simply nodded. She did not cry. She did not plead. She just nodded because she already knew. She had known before she started walking. She had walked anyway, because what else could a mother do? Ernesto gave her what little medicine he had, knowing it would not be enough. He watched her walk away, the child on her back, disappearing into the mountains. And he stood there in the fading light, his hands empty, his chest tight not from asthma but from rage. This was not medicine. This was triage in a war that no one was acknowledging. And the enemy was not disease. The enemy was a system that decided some lives mattered and some did not. A system that let children die because their parents were poor, because they lived in the wrong place, because they spoke the wrong language, because they were indigenous, because they were inconvenient. He began to see imperialism everywhere, not as an abstraction, not as a word in a textbook, but as a structure, a weight pressing down on everything. The mines that poisoned men were owned by foreign companies. The land that grew cash crops instead of food belonged to foreign investors. The governments that ignored their own people were propped up by foreign powers. And the pattern repeated in every country he entered, in Bolivia, in Colombia, in Venezuela. The wealth flowed upward and outward, out of the continent, into the hands of people who had never set foot in these villages, who had never breathed this air, who would never know the names of the people they were crushing. In Bogota, Colombia, he and Alberto witnessed a protest. Workers marching through the streets, demanding better wages, better conditions, the basic dignity of being treated as human. The police met them with clubs and tear gas. Ernesto watched from the edge of the crowd, his eyes burning, his lungs seizing. And he saw how quickly order could turn to violence, how quickly the state would defend property over people. He saw a man beaten to the ground, saw blood on the pavement, saw the crowd scatter and regroup, refusing to disappear. And he felt something harden inside him. A certainty, a knowing, that this would not change through appeals or reforms or patient negotiations. That power does not give itself away, that it has to be taken. But he was not yet a revolutionary. He was still searching, still trying to understand the shape of the problem before he could imagine the shape of the solution. He and Alberto continued north, crossing into Venezuela, and there the oil fields stretched out like black seas, the wealth of the earth being pumped out and shipped away while the people who lived above it remained poor. Ernesto worked briefly in a leper colony there too, and again he saw the same abandonment, the same indifference, the same cruelty disguised as policy. By the time they reached Caracas, they had been traveling for 9 months. They were exhausted, sun-scorched, carrying diseases in their own bodies, now parasites, infections, the inevitable cost of moving through a world without barriers. Alberto decided to stay in Venezuela. He had been offered work in a leper colony, and he took it, ready to settle, ready to rest. But Ernesto could not stay. He had seen too much. He had changed too much. He needed to finish his degree, yes, but more than that, he needed to think, to process, to figure out what all of this meant and what he was supposed to do with it. He returned to Buenos Aires in August 1952, thin and restless, and no longer the young man who had left. His family barely recognized him. Not his face, which was darkened by sun and hardship, but his eyes. There was something different in them now, something awake, something that would not go back to sleep. He finished his final year of medical school with a fierce focus, completing his exams, earning his degree. He was now Dr. Ernesto Guevara, but the title felt hollow. He had no interest in opening a practice, in treating the comfortable, in living a safe and predictable life. He had seen the wound, and he could not pretend it was not there. And so, as the year turned and 1953 arrived, he made another decision. He would leave again, this time with his younger friend, Carlos Ferrer, a biochemist known as Calica. They would travel north, through Bolivia, through Peru again, through Ecuador. And this time, Ernesto would not just observe. He would search. He would look for answers, for movements, for people who were already fighting. Because he knew now that he could not heal the world one patient at a time, The sickness was too deep. The system was too vast. And somewhere out there, he believed, there had to be another way. The night wraps around him as he packs his bag once more. The inhaler goes in first, always. Then the journal, worn and thick with words. Then a few clothes, a few books. His mother watches from the doorway, saying nothing, understanding everything. He kisses her cheek. He walks out into the dark. And the road, patient and endless, waits for him once more. The second journey was not an adventure. It was an investigation. Ernesto and Calica moved through the continent with purpose now, not as wanderers, but as seekers. They traveled through Bolivia first, arriving in La Paz just as the country was trembling with change. A revolution had erupted the year before, in 1952, led by miners and peasants who had finally refused to accept their own erasure. The government had nationalized the tin mines, had begun land reforms, had armed the workers and the indigenous communities. And for a moment, just a moment, it seemed like the impossible was happening. That a country could belong to its people instead of to its masters. Ernesto walked through the streets of La Paz, breathing the thin air at 12,000 feet, his lungs protesting, his inhaler working overtime. But he pushed through it because he needed to see this, needed to understand what a revolution looked like when it was still new, still unfinished, still fragile. He talked to miners who had fought with dynamite and bare hands. He talked to campesinos who had reclaimed land that had been stolen from their grandparents. He talked to organizers who spoke of socialism, of indigenous rights, of a future that did not replicate the past. And he listened. He absorbed. He learned. But he also saw the fractures. The revolution was incomplete. The United States was already circling, already applying pressure, already working to undermine what had been built. The new government was caught between the demands of its people and the demands of foreign powers, and Ernesto could see how fragile the whole thing was, how easily it could be crushed or co-opted. He wrote in his journal that a revolution without teeth was just a gesture. That changing ownership was not enough if you did not also change the structures that allowed exploitation to continue. That real transformation required more than laws. It required vigilance. It required sacrifice. It required, perhaps, violence. He was beginning to think in those terms now. Not violence for its own sake, but violence as a tool, as a necessity when every other door had been closed. He had seen peaceful protests met with clubs. He had seen strikes broken by soldiers. He had seen governments that claimed to represent the people serve only the powerful. And he was starting to believe that the powerful would never surrender willingly, that they would kill to preserve what they had, and that any movement serious about liberation would have to be willing to meet that violence with violence of its own. It was a dark thought, a heavy thought, but he could not shake it. From Bolivia, they moved into Peru again, then Ecuador, then north towards Central America. In every country, the pattern repeated. Wealth extracted, people exploited, governments complicit. But he also saw resistance. He saw unions organizing in the shadows. He saw indigenous communities preserving their cultures despite centuries of suppression. He saw students forming study groups, workers forming cooperatives, priests preaching liberation theology. The seeds of change were everywhere, scattered and struggling, but alive. And he began to feel that he was not alone in his anger, that there was a current moving beneath the surface of the continent, a rumbling that might one day become an earthquake. In December 1953, he arrived in Guatemala, and everything changed. Guatemala was attempting something radical. The government, led by President Jacobo Renz, was trying to reform the country from within, using democracy, using the law. Renz had begun redistributing land, taking unused property from the American-owned United Fruit Company and giving it to landless peasants. He was building schools, roads, hospitals. He was trying to create a country that served its people instead of foreign corporations. And the United States, predictably, was calling him a communist, a threat, a danger that needed to be eliminated. Ernesto arrived in Guatemala City and found a place electric with possibility and dread. Exiles from across Latin America had gathered there, drawn by the hope that Renz represented. There were Cubans who had fled Batista's dictatorship, Nicaraguans who had escaped Somoza, Peruvians, Venezuelans, Argentines, all of them dreamers and fighters and believers in the idea that another world was possible. Ernesto moved among them, listening, debating, learning. He met Hilda Gadia, a Peruvian economist and activist, a woman as politically engaged as he was, maybe more so. She was older, more experienced, better read in Marxist theory. And she challenged him, pushed him, forced him to sharpen his ideas, to move beyond anger and into analysis. They spent hours in cafes, arguing about capitalism and imperialism, about Lenin and Trotsky, about whether change could come through elections or only through armed struggle. Hilda introduced him to texts he had never read, to frameworks that gave structure to everything he had felt but could not yet articulate. She taught him that revolution was not just rage, it was science. It was strategy. It was understanding the mechanics of power so thoroughly that you could dismantle them. And Ernesto, who had always been a student, who had always devoured knowledge, threw himself into this new education with the same intensity he had once brought to medicine. But even as he was learning, even as he was falling in love with Hilda, even as he was beginning to imagine himself as something more than a witness, the ground was shifting beneath him. The United States had decided that Renz had to go. The CIA was already working with Guatemalan exiles, training them, funding them, preparing an invasion. The propaganda machine was in full operation, painting Guatemala as a Soviet puppet, as a threat to freedom, as a domino that would topple all of Central America into communism if it was not stopped. And Ernesto watched it happen in real time, watched the lies spread, watched the pressure build, watched a country that was trying to help its own people be labeled an enemy. In June 1954, the invasion came. A small force of exiles, backed by American planes and American money, crossed the border from Honduras. The Guatemalan army, riddled with officers who had been bribed or threatened, refused to fight. Renz, desperate, tried to arm the workers, the peasants, the people who had the most to lose. But the weapons never came. The organization never materialized. And within days, it was over. Renz resigned and fled. A military dictatorship took his place, and the reforms were rolled back. The land returned to United Fruit, the dream crushed. Ernesto was in the Argentine embassy when it happened, seeking refuge along with hundreds of others who knew what was coming. He watched through the windows as the soldiers took control of the streets, as the arrests began, as the purges started. He listened to the radio as the new government announced its victory, as it promised stability and order, as it erased everything Renz had tried to build. And something inside him broke. Not his spirit, his illusions. He had seen a democratic government, elected by the people, trying to serve the people, destroyed by a foreign power, because it dared to challenge corporate interests. He had seen that reform was not tolerated, that moderation was not rewarded, that the empire would crush anything that threatened its profits. And he understood, finally, what he had been moving toward all along, that there was no middle path, that you could not negotiate with an enemy that would kill you for asking for dignity, that the only way to win was to fight fully and without compromise, to build a movement that could not be bought or intimidated or destroyed. He had been a student. He had been an observer. He had been a doctor who wanted to heal. But Guatemala taught him that healing required more than medicine. It required revolution. And revolution required revolutionaries. He left Guatemala in September, hollow and hardened, carrying Hilda with him. They made their way to Mexico City, where exiles gathered like ghosts, where failed revolutions came to regroup and dream of return. And Ernesto, who had been searching for a way to turn his anger into action, who had been looking for a path, was about to find one. Because in Mexico City, in a cramped apartment thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of history, a man named Fidel Castro was planning an invasion of Cuba. And when Ernesto met him, when their eyes locked and their minds recognized each other, the future clicked into place. The boy who could not breathe had learned to fight for air. The student had become a theorist. The traveler had found his destination. And the doctor, who had once believed he could heal the world one patient at a time, now understood that the world itself was the patient, and it would take more than medicine to save it. Mexico City in 1954 was a city of echoes and exiles. It was where revolutions came to die or to be reborn, where men who had lost their countries came to plan their return, where hope and desperation shared the same cheap rooms and the same strong coffee. Ernesto arrived there with Hilda, both of them hollow from Guatemala, both of them understanding now what the world did to dreamers who tried to change it through the rules. They found work where they could. Ernesto took odd jobs, worked briefly at a hospital, tried to make enough to survive while he figured out what came next. But survival was not what drove him anymore. He was looking for something larger, for a cause, for a movement, for people who had not given up. Mexico City was full of Cubans. They came in waves, fleeing the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, a man who had seized power through a coup and ruled through brutality and greed. Batista had turned Cuba into a playground for American tourists and American corporations, a place where casinos thrived and sugar profits flowed north while ordinary Cubans lived in poverty. The exiles in Mexico spoke of him with hatred, with bitterness, with the particular fury of people who had been forced from their own land. And among them was a young lawyer named Fidel Castro, who had tried to start a revolution in Cuba and failed, who had been imprisoned and then exiled, and who was now planning to go back. Ernesto met him in July 1955. It was late at night, in an apartment where revolutionaries gathered to talk and argue and plan. Fidel was 28 years old, tall and commanding, with a thick beard already growing and a voice that filled rooms. He spoke with absolute certainty, with a conviction so complete it seemed to bend reality toward it. He talked about Cuba, about its history, about how it had won independence from Spain only to be swallowed by American influence, how it had never truly been free, how Batista was just the latest in a long line of men who had sold the country piece by piece. And he talked about going back, not to negotiate, not to reform, but to fight, to wage guerrilla war in the mountains until the dictatorship fell and Cuba could finally belong to Cubans. Ernesto listened, and something in him recognized something in Fidel. They were different in almost every way. Fidel was Cuban, rooted in his island, fighting for his homeland. Ernesto was Argentine, rootless, fighting for an idea that transcended borders. Fidel was a talker, loud and charismatic and theatrical. Ernesto was quieter, more analytical, more comfortable with silence. But they shared something deeper, a refusal. A conviction that the world as it existed was intolerable and that they, personally, had a responsibility to change it. They talked through the night, testing each other, challenging each other, finding the edges where their minds aligned. By morning, Ernesto had made his decision. He would join them. He would go to Cuba and fight in a war that was not his own, for a country that was not his home, because he had come to believe that all of Latin America was one struggle, one wound, one fight. Fidel asked him if he knew how to fight, and Ernesto said no, but that he could learn. Fidel asked him if he was afraid to die, and Ernesto said everyone was afraid, but that fear was not a reason to stay still. And Fidel, who had a gift for seeing what people could become, who had a hunger for true believers, accepted him. Not as a doctor, though they would need one, as a soldier, as a comrade, as a revolutionary, the training began. Fidel had gathered a small group of men, maybe 24 at first, then more as word spread. They were students, workers, exiles, all of them willing to risk everything for the chance to go home or to build a home worth going back to. They trained in secret, in rented houses on the outskirts of Mexico City, learning to shoot, to move in formation, to think like guerrillas. Ernesto threw himself into it with the discipline of someone who had spent his life overcoming his own body. His asthma flared constantly. The physical exertion, the dust, the stress, all of it conspired to choke him, but he pushed through. He woke early to run. He practiced shooting until his hands steadied. He studied military tactics, reading Mao and Che Guevara, learning how small forces could defeat large armies through mobility and popular support. It was during this time that he acquired the nickname that would follow him forever. The Cubans heard him use the Argentine expression Che, a casual term like hey or buddy, and they started calling him Che. At first it was teasing, affectionate, a way of marking him as the outsider, the Argentine among Cubans. But Ernesto did not mind. He wore it like a second skin. Che. It was simpler than Ernesto, more direct, more suited to who he was becoming. And so Ernesto Guevara, the boy from Rosario, the medical student, the traveler, began to disappear. In his place, Che was emerging. Harder, clearer, more certain. In May 1955, Ernesto and Hilda married. It was a quiet ceremony, practical more than romantic. Hilda was pregnant, and marriage made things simpler legally, safer for her and the child. Ernesto cared for her, respected her, learned from her. But his mind was already elsewhere. It was in the mountains of Cuba that he had never seen. It was in the training camps. It was in the future that Fidel promised, a future where the oppressed would rise and the empire would fall and a new world would be born from the ashes of the old. Their daughter, Hilda Beatriz, was born in February 1956. Ernesto held her, this tiny fragile life, and felt the weight of fatherhood settle on him. But it did not change his course. If anything, it sharpened it. He was fighting for her future now, for a world where she would not have to live under the boot of imperialism, where her life would have value not because of her nationality or her wealth, but because she was human. He kissed her small forehead and promised her silently that he would make the world better or die trying. The preparations intensified. Fidel had purchased a yacht, an old beaten vessel called the Granma, barely seaworthy, but large enough to carry them across the strait between Mexico and Cuba. The plan was simple to the point of recklessness. They would sail to Cuba, land on the eastern coast, disappear into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, and wage guerrilla war until the people rose and Batista fell. It was audacity masquerading as strategy. It was belief stronger than logic. And Che, who had learned in Guatemala that moderation led only to defeat, who had seen that the empire would crush anything less than total commitment, embraced it fully. In November 1956, the Mexican police raided one of their safe houses. Che and several others were arrested, thrown into prison while the authorities decided what to do with them. For weeks, he sat in a cell, unsure if the mission was over before it began, unsure if he would be deported or handed over to Batista's agents or simply left to rot. But Fidel, through bribes and connections and sheer force of will, got them released. And on November 25, 1956, 82 men crowded onto the Granma and set sail from Tuxpan, Mexico, heading toward Cuba, toward war, toward history. The crossing was a nightmare. The boat was overloaded, listing dangerously, taking on water. The men were seasick, cramped, miserable. Che's asthma raged in the salt air and the confined space, and he spent much of the journey struggling to breathe, clutching his inhaler, wondering if he would drown before he ever set foot on Cuban soil. The voyage that should have taken 5 days took 7. They missed their landing coordinates. They arrived 2 days late in the wrong place, in daylight instead of darkness. And when they finally came ashore, stumbling through a swamp, exhausted and disoriented, Batista's forces were waiting. The ambush came fast and brutal. Planes strafed them from above. Soldiers surrounded them on the ground. The revolutionaries scattered into the sugarcane fields, into the swamps, running for their lives. Most were killed in the first days. Others were captured and executed. The revolution, barely begun, seemed already finished. Out of 82 men, only a handful survived. Che was one of them. He had been shot at, had dropped his medical supplies to grab a box of ammunition, had made a choice in that moment about who he was and what he valued. He was not a doctor anymore. He was a soldier. And he ran into the mountains with the others, hunted and starving and refusing to quit. In the Sierra Maestra, the survivors regrouped. There were maybe 15 of them at first, then 12, then fewer. They had almost no weapons, no food, no contact with the outside world. They should have died there, should have been hunted down and forgotten, but they did not die. They survived, and slowly, impossibly, they began to grow. Peasants brought them food, recruits trickled in, and Che, the Argentine who had come to fight someone else's war, became one of the revolution's most trusted commanders. The boy who could not breathe had learned to survive in the thin air of the mountains, and the war, brutal and beautiful and unforgiving, was just beginning. The night holds him there, crouched in the mountains, his rifle across his knees, his lungs burning, his future unknowable. But he is not afraid. He is awake. He is alive. And he is exactly where he needs to be. Guatemala broke him open, but it was Mexico that put him back together, sharper and more dangerous than before. The lessons of Guatemala lived in him like scars, each one a reminder that good intentions were not enough, that elections could be overthrown, that reform could be crushed, that the empire had no mercy for those who challenged it. He had watched Jacobo Renz try to change Guatemala through democracy, through law, through the patient work of building institutions. And he had watched it all collapse in 10 days. The CIA had funded the coup. American planes had flown the bombing runs. And a government that had tried to feed its people, that had tried to give land to the landless, had been destroyed and labeled communist, labeled dangerous, labeled a threat to freedom. The word freedom, Che learned, was elastic in the mouths of empires. It meant freedom for corporations, freedom for capital, freedom to exploit. It did not mean freedom for the poor. So when he arrived in Mexico City with Hilda in September 1954, he was no longer searching for answers. He had found them, bitter and clarifying. The question now was what to do with them. How to turn understanding into action. How to move from analysis to revolution. Mexico City was full of people asking the same question. Exiles from across the continent. Men and women who had fled dictatorships and failures and massacres, who gathered in cramped apartments to smoke and argue and dream of the day they could go home. It was a city of ghosts who refused to die. Ernesto found work at the General Hospital, taking photographs for medical research on allergies. It was humble work, technical and removed, and it paid barely enough to survive. But survival was not the point anymore. He was buying time, waiting for something, though he did not yet know what. Hilda was more engaged than he was, more connected to the exile networks, more versed in Marxist theory. She was his teacher in many ways, pushing him to read Lenin and Marx more carefully, to understand the mechanics of class struggle, to see that revolution was not just rage but science, not just courage but strategy. She introduced him to other exiles, other thinkers, and slowly his world expanded. But he was restless. He had seen too much to be satisfied with theory alone. Books could explain the world, but they could not change it. He needed something more immediate, more concrete. He needed a movement he could join, a cause he could serve with his body and not just his mind. And then, in the summer of 1955, in a small apartment where Cuban exiles gathered, he met the man who would give him exactly that. Fidel Castro entered the room like weather, loud and magnetic and impossible to ignore. He was only a year older than Che, but he carried himself with the authority of someone who had already lived several lifetimes. He had been a lawyer, an activist, a failed revolutionary. In 1953, he had led an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, trying to spark an uprising against the dictator Fulgencio Batista. The attack had failed spectacularly. Most of his comrades were killed or captured and tortured. Fidel himself was imprisoned, and he used his trial to deliver a speech that became legendary, a defiant proclamation that history would absolve him, that the revolution was inevitable, that Batista's days were numbered. He was sentenced to 15 years, but served less than 2 before political pressure forced Batista to release him. And now he was in Mexico, gathering men and resources, planning to go back. The apartment was thick with smoke and the smell of strong coffee. Che sat in the corner, watching as Fidel held court, as he paced in gestures and spoke with a passion that seemed to fill every empty space. Fidel talked about Cuba, about how it had been a colony of Spain and then a colony of the United States, how it had never been truly independent, how its wealth flowed north while its people starved. He talked about Batista, about the corruption, the violence. The way the dictator had turned the island into a casino for American tourists while Cubans lived in slums. And he talked about the plan. They would return to Cuba by boat. They would land in secret, disappear into the mountains, and wage guerrilla war. They would turn the Sierra Maestra into a fortress and a symbol. And they would not stop until Batista was gone and Cuba was free. It was madness, of course. A handful of exiles with barely any weapons trying to overthrow a regime backed by the United States military. But Che did not hear madness. He heard clarity. He heard someone who understood what Guatemala had taught him, that you could not negotiate with power, that you had to take it. And more than that, he heard someone who was willing to act, who was not content to theorize or wait or hope for conditions to improve. Fidel was going to fight, and he was looking for people willing to fight with him. They talked that night, just the two of them after the others had left. They tested each other, probing for weakness, for doubt, for the soft edges that separate believers from talkers. Fidel asked Che why an Argentine would want to fight for Cuba, and Che said he did not see borders the way other people did, that the struggle was the same everywhere, that imperialism did not respect nations, so why should revolutionaries? Fidel asked if he was willing to die, and Che said everyone dies. The question is what you die for. Fidel asked if he could fight, and Che admitted he had never held a gun in anger, but that he was a fast learner, and that his asthma had taught him how to endure things that should break a person. And Fidel, who had a gift for reading people, who could see past what they were to what they could become, saw in Che something he needed. Not just another soldier, but a true believer. Someone whose commitment was not to Cuba, but to the idea of revolution itself. Someone who would not waver, who would not negotiate, who would push forward no matter the cost. Fidel extended his hand, and Che took it. And in that moment, the course of history shifted. Two men, two revolutionaries, two forces that would amplify each other, that would become inseparable in the world's imagination, had joined their fates. The training began almost immediately. Fidel had rented a ranch outside Mexico City, a remote place where they could practice without drawing attention. The group was small at first, maybe 20 men, all of them Cuban except for Che. They trained in the early mornings and late evenings, learning to shoot, to move through terrain without being seen, to live off the land. Che approached it with the discipline of someone who had spent his life mastering his own weaknesses. His asthma was as bad as ever, maybe worse from the exertion and the dust, but he refused to let it slow him down. He ran when his lungs screamed at him to stop. He practiced marksmanship until his hands steadied. He studied military theory, reading everything he could find on guerrilla warfare, on Mao's campaigns in China, on the tactics of small forces defeating larger ones. The Cubans watched him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. He was the outsider, the foreigner, the one who did not have to be there. But he trained harder than most of them, pushed himself further, asked for no special treatment. And slowly, the nickname stuck. Che. At first, it was just the way he spoke, the Argentine slang that mocked him as different. But it became more than that. It became his identity. Ernesto Guevara was fading. Che was being born. And he wore the name like armor, like a second skin that fit better than the first. Hilda was pregnant now, and the news should have changed things. Should have made him reconsider, made him think about staying, about being a father, about choosing safety over sacrifice. But it did not. If anything, it clarified his purpose. He was not just fighting for the present. He was fighting for the future, for the world his daughter would inherit. And that world, he believed, could not be built through patience or compromise. It had to be torn down and rebuilt from the ground up. He told Hilda this, and she understood, even if it hurt her. She had always known who he was, what drove him, and she loved him for it, even as it pulled him away from her. The group grew. More Cubans joined, drawn by Fidel's charisma and the promise of action. They trained harder, longer, preparing for a war that felt both inevitable and impossible. And Che, who had once been a doctor who wanted to heal, who had traveled across a continent trying to understand suffering, was now a soldier learning how to kill. The transformation was not easy. It required him to set aside parts of himself, to harden, to accept that revolution was not clean or gentle or kind, but he did it. Because he had seen what happened when people were not willing to fight. He had seen Guatemala, and he would not let that happen again. The months in Mexico were a fever dream of preparation and sacrifice. The ranch where they trained became a world unto itself, a place where ordinary life dissolved and only the revolution mattered. They woke before dawn and trained until their bodies gave out. They learned to assemble and disassemble weapons blindfolded, to navigate by stars, to move through jungle terrain without leaving traces. Fidel was relentless, driving them harder whenever he sensed complacency, reminding them that Batista's army would show no mercy, that they had to be harder, faster, more committed than anyone chasing them. And Che absorbed it all, his notebook filling with observations, tactical notes, reflections on what separated successful guerrilla movements from failed ones. He was becoming a theorist of violence, not because he loved it, but because he understood its necessity. He wrote in his journal about the moral weight of taking a life, about how revolution required a willingness to cross lines that peaceful society drew. He wrote about how sentimentality could kill a movement, how mercy shown to the wrong person at the wrong time could lead to the deaths of hundreds. He was teaching himself to be ruthless, and it cost him something. There was a coldness growing in him, a distance that even Hilda noticed. He was still capable of tenderness, still capable of love, but it was becoming compartmentalized, something he allowed himself in brief moments before returning to the harder work of becoming a weapon. In February 1956, their daughter was born. They named her Hilda Beatriz, and Che held her in the hospital, this impossibly small life, and felt the full weight of fatherhood settle on his shoulders. She was perfect and fragile and utterly dependent, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine a different life. A life where he stayed, where he opened a clinic, where he watched her grow up, where he chose the small happiness of family over the grand tragedy of revolution. But the moment passed, because he looked at her and saw not just his daughter, but all the children across Latin America who were born into poverty and exploitation, who would never have the chances she might have, who would die young or live broken because the world was designed to consume them. And he knew he could not choose his daughter over them. He had to fight for all of them, or his love for her meant nothing. Hilda understood, or tried to. She had always been a revolutionary herself, had always believed in the cause. But belief is different when it asks you to give up the man you love, when it asks you to raise a child alone, when it turns your husband into a ghost who visits between wars. They did not fight about it. There was nothing to fight about. Che had made his choice long before Hilda Beatriz was born, maybe even before he met Hilda, maybe as far back as that night in Rosario, when he first struggled to breathe and learned that the world was not built for everyone to survive. He kissed his daughter's forehead, memorizing her smell, her weight, the way her tiny fingers curled around his thumb. And then he went back to the ranch, back to the training, back to the future he had chosen. The Mexican authorities were watching them now. Fidel's group was no secret, and Batista's agents were everywhere, bribing officials, spreading rumors, trying to disrupt the operation before it could leave the ground. In June 1956, the police raided one of their safe houses. Che and several others were arrested, thrown into cells while the authorities decided what to do with them. For weeks, he sat in prison, reading when he could, doing exercises to keep his body strong, refusing to let the confinement break his focus. He was interrogated, pressured to inform on Fidel, offered his freedom if he would just walk away. But he gave them nothing. Not a name, not a detail, not a crack in his resolve. And eventually, through Fidel's connections and bribes and political maneuvering, they were released. By November, everything was ready. Fidel had purchased a yacht, an old vessel called the Granma, named after the previous owner's grandmother. It was barely seaworthy, designed to carry maybe 20 people comfortably. But they crammed 82 men onto it, along with weapons, supplies, and enough hope to sink a sturdier ship. The plan was to sail from Tuxpan, Mexico, to the eastern coast of Cuba, to land in secret and disappear into the Sierra Maestra Mountains before Batista's forces could react. It was coordinated with an uprising in Santiago de Cuba, a distraction that would pull the army's attention away from their landing. Timing was everything, and timing, as it turned out, would be their first failure. On November 25, 1956, they set sail. The weather was already turning, the sea rough and unwelcoming, but they could not wait any longer. The Mexican authorities were closing in, and if they delayed, they might never leave at all. So they pushed off into the darkness, 82 men who had trained for this moment, who had given up everything for this chance, who believed with a faith beyond reason that they could change the world. Che stood on the deck as Mexico disappeared behind them, feeling the spray on his face, the lurch of the boat beneath his feet, and the tightness in his chest that was both asthma and anticipation. He was leaving behind his daughter, his wife, his country, his old life. He was sailing toward war. And he had never felt more certain of anything. The voyage was hell. The Granma was overloaded and taking on water almost immediately. Men were crammed into every available space, sitting on top of each other, unable to move, unable to breathe. Seasickness swept through them like a plague. The smell of vomit mixed with diesel fuel and sweat, and the boat became a floating nightmare. Che's asthma raged in the confined, humid air. He spent much of the journey huddled below deck, using his inhaler constantly, fighting for each breath, wondering if he would drown before he ever reached Cuba. But he did not complain. He did not ask for special treatment. He endured because endurance was what the revolution required. The crossing that should have taken 5 days took 7. The yacht's engine kept failing. The navigation was off. They were late, desperately late, and the uprising in Santiago that was supposed to cover their landing had already happened and been crushed. By the time they approached the Cuban coast on December 2nd, in full daylight instead of the planned darkness, they were exhausted, disoriented, and already compromised. They ran aground on a sandbar near a place called Las Coloradas, not on a beach but in a mangrove swamp, and the men had to abandon the boat and wade through chest-deep water and mud, carrying what weapons they could, leaving behind most of their supplies. They stumbled onto land like shipwreck survivors, muddy and gasping and vulnerable. And Batista's forces, alerted by the failed uprising and by fishermen who had spotted the yacht, were already moving into position. For 3 days, the revolutionaries tried to regroup, tried to move inland toward the mountains. But they were lost, starving, drinking from swamps, their feet shredded by their boots, their bodies shutting down from exhaustion. And then, on December 5th, near a place called Alegria de Pio, the trap closed. The ambush came from everywhere at once. Batista's soldiers opened fire from the tree line, and planes strafed them from above. The revolutionaries scattered, dropping their weapons, running for their lives. Men fell all around Che, some dead before they hit the ground, others screaming, crawling, trying to find cover where there was none. Che was hit, a bullet grazing his neck, and for a moment he thought he was dying. He fell into the sugarcane, his medical bag beside him, a box of ammunition nearby. And in that instant, he made a choice that would define him. He reached for the ammunition instead of the medicine. He grabbed the weapon instead of the healing. The doctor was gone. Only the revolutionary remained. He ran into the swamp with a handful of others, the sound of gunfire and screaming fading behind him. For days they wandered, separated from Fidel, from most of the group, unsure who had survived and who had died. They ate raw corn and sugarcane. They drank from ditches. They moved at night and hid during the day, hunted like animals, waiting for the bullet or the capture that seemed inevitable. Out of 82 men who had left Mexico, only a fraction survived the first week. The revolution, barely begun, appeared to be over before it started. But it was not over. Because in the mountains, in the Sierra Maestra, the survivors began to find each other. Fidel was alive. Raul, his brother, was alive. Che was alive, and slowly, impossibly, they regrouped. They were maybe 15 men at first, armed with a handful of rifles, starving and hunted and seemingly doomed, but they did not surrender. They moved deeper into the mountains, into terrain so remote that even Batista's soldiers struggled to follow. And there, in the green hell of the Sierra Maestra, the revolution took root. Che sat on a rock one night, his rifle across his knees, his chest heaving with the effort of breathing, and he looked out at the darkness. Somewhere below, in the valleys and the cities, people were living ordinary lives, unaware that above them, in the mountains, a handful of men were refusing to die, refusing to quit, refusing to accept that the world could not be changed. And Che smiled, just a little, because he had found what he was looking for. Not comfort, not safety, not even victory, not yet, but purpose. Absolute, clarifying, undeniable purpose. And nothing, not even death, could take that away from him. The Sierra Maestra was not a place. It was a test, a crucible. A mountain range that ran along Cuba's southeastern coast, thick with jungle and mist, so remote that even the peasants who lived there existed almost outside the reach of government, outside the reach of modernity, outside the reach of anyone who did not need to be there. And now it was home to 15 men who had nothing but rifles and conviction. They moved through the mountains like ghosts, sleeping in caves, bathing in cold streams, eating whatever the land offered or whatever peasants would share. And slowly, day by day, they learned what it meant to survive. Che threw himself into the work of becoming a guerrilla. He studied the terrain, mapping it in his mind, learning which paths were safe and which were watched, where water could be found, where the army feared to go. He learned to move silently, to read the forest for signs of soldiers, to distinguish between the sounds that meant safety and the sounds that meant death. And he learned to live with hunger, real hunger, the kind that empties you out and makes every thought about food. They ate once a day if they were lucky, sometimes less. They chewed sugarcane until their jaws ached. They boiled roots and leaves that tasted like nothing but kept them alive. And Che, whose asthma should have killed him in that altitude and humidity, somehow endured. His body had always been his enemy, but now it learned to be his ally. It adapted. It survived. The peasants were their lifeline. At first, the campesinos were terrified, caught between the guerrillas and Batista's army, unsure who would win and knowing they would suffer regardless. But the revolutionaries treated them differently than the soldiers did. Batista's men took what they wanted, burned homes, raped women, killed anyone they suspected of helping the rebels. But Fidel's men paid for food. They helped with harvests. They treated the peasants with respect, as equals, as allies. And slowly, the campesinos began to trust them. They brought food in secret. They carried messages. They hid the guerrillas when the army came searching. And some of their sons joined the fight, young men who had spent their lives poor and invisible, who now saw a chance to matter, to fight for something larger than survival. Che became a teacher. He taught the new recruits how to shoot, how to maintain their weapons, how to think strategically. But he also taught them to read. At night, by the light of small fires that they kept hidden in the dense brush, he held literacy classes, teaching peasant boys who had never been to school how to form letters, how to read words, how to understand the world beyond the mountains. He believed that revolution was not just about seizing power. It was about transforming people, about giving them the tools to understand their own oppression and the capacity to imagine something different. And so he taught, patiently, stubbornly, even when they were exhausted, even when the army was close, even when it seemed like a luxury they could not afford. But he also learned to kill. The first time was in January 1957, during a raid on a small army outpost. They ambushed the soldiers at dawn, and in the chaos, Che found himself face to face with a young man, barely older than a boy, fumbling with his rifle. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Che saw the fear there, saw the humanity. And then he pulled the trigger. The soldier fell, and Che stood over him, watching the light fade from his eyes, feeling nothing and everything at once. He wrote about it later, clinically, analyzing his own reaction, noting that he had hesitated, but not enough to matter, that the revolution required this, that sentiment was a weakness he could not afford. He was teaching himself to be hard, to carry death without being destroyed by it. Fidel promoted him quickly, recognizing in Che a rare combination of intelligence, discipline, and ideological clarity. By mid-1957, Che was a commander, leading his own column of fighters, responsible not just for fighting but for strategy, for discipline, for making the decisions that kept men alive or sent them to their deaths. He was barely 30 years old, a foreigner in a Cuban revolution, and yet the men followed him without question. They followed him because he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. He marched at the front, slept less than anyone, ate last when food was scarce, and he was ruthless with failure and cowardice. Men who deserted were hunted down. Men who stole from peasants were punished. Men who endangered the group through carelessness were expelled. Che believed that revolution required purity of purpose, that a single weakling could destroy everything, and he would not tolerate weakness. He also set up hospitals in the mountains, makeshift field clinics where the wounded could be treated, where peasants could come for care they had never had access to before. The doctor in him had not completely disappeared. It had simply been subordinated to the revolutionary. He trained medics, stockpiled what medicines they could capture or purchase, performed surgeries in caves by lamplight. He saved lives when he could. But he also understood that the hospital was as much a political tool as a medical one. It showed the peasants that the revolution cared for them, that it offered something tangible, something real. And it created loyalty that no amount of propaganda could manufacture. The war was brutal and slow. Batista's army was huge, well-equipped, backed by American weapons and American advisors. The guerrillas numbered in the dozens, then the hundreds, never more than a few thousand even at their peak. But they had advantages the army did not. They knew the terrain, they had popular support, and they fought with a conviction that no salary could buy. Every ambush, every raid, every small victory chipped away at the regime's legitimacy. The newspapers began reporting on the guerrillas, sometimes mocking them, sometimes fearing them. Batista sent more soldiers, but the mountains swallowed them. He sent planes, but the jungle hid the rebels. And slowly, the impossible began to seem possible. Foreign journalists started arriving, smuggled into the mountains to interview Fidel and document the revolution. Che was often there, quiet and intense in the background, his beard growing wild, his uniform tattered, his eyes burning with something the journalists could not quite name. He was becoming famous without seeking fame, his image circulating in newspapers and magazines. The Argentine doctor who fought for Cuba, the intellectual guerrilla, the revolutionary who read philosophy between battles. The myth was beginning to form, even as the man remained focused on the war. But the war took everything from him. His marriage to Hilda, already strained by distance and ideology, dissolved quietly. She remained in Mexico with their daughter, and Che wrote letters when he could. Brief and formal, more reports than love letters. He had chosen the revolution, and that choice left no room for the ordinary demands of marriage and fatherhood. It was not that he did not love them. It was that he loved the idea of liberation more, and he could not be both a revolutionary and a husband, both a soldier and a father. Something had to be sacrificed, and he sacrificed the personal for the political, without hesitation and without regret. And in the mountains, among the fighters and the smoke and the constant nearness of death, he fell in love again. Her name was Elida March, a young Cuban woman who worked with the urban resistance, who had come to the Sierra Maestra to coordinate with the guerrillas. She was fierce and intelligent and unafraid, and she saw in Che not the myth but the man, exhausted and driven and carrying the weight of the world on his narrow shoulders. They did not speak of love at first. There was no time for courtship, no space for romance in the middle of a war. But something formed between them, a connection forged in shared purpose, in mutual respect, in the understanding that they were both willing to die for something larger than themselves. The revolution was no longer a dream. It was a reality, grinding forward day by day, battle by battle, sacrifice by sacrifice. And Che, who had arrived in Cuba as an outsider, as an observer who became a participant, was now one of its architects. He had stopped being Ernesto Guevara, the doctor. He had even stopped being simply Che the soldier. He was becoming Che Guevara, the revolutionary, the symbol, the man whose face would outlive his body, whose ideas would outlive his death. But he did not know that yet. He only knew that the war was not over, that Batista still ruled, that the people were still suffering. And so he kept fighting, kept climbing, kept pushing forward through the green darkness of the mountains, toward a future he could imagine but not yet see. The night wrapped around him like a promise and a threat. Somewhere below, the cities glowed with electric light. Somewhere above, the stars watched without judgment. And in between, in the thin cold air of the Sierra Maestra, a revolution breathed and grew and prepared to change the world. There are places that remake you, places so harsh, so unforgiving, that you either break or become something harder, something new. The Sierra Maestra was such a place. It was not just a mountain range. It was a forge, and the men who survived it were not the same men who entered it. They emerged tempered, changed, carrying scars both visible and invisible, marked by something that those who had not been there could never fully understand. For Che, the mountains were where the last remnants of the old self burned away, where the boy from Rosario and the medical student from Buenos Aires disappeared completely, and where the revolutionary cold, disciplined, uncompromising, was finally born. The early months were the hardest. In those first weeks after the disaster at Alegria de Payo, survival itself felt like victory. The 15 men who found each other in the mountains were starving, exhausted, hunted by an army that wanted them dead or captured. They moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice, always listening for the sound of boots or helicopters, always ready to run. Che's asthma should have killed him. The altitude, the humidity, the constant exertion, all of it conspired against his damaged lungs. But somehow he adapted. His body, which had betrayed him his entire life, learned to function on the edge of collapse. He carried his inhaler, used it when the attacks came, and then kept moving. Because stopping meant death, and death was not acceptable. Not yet. Not when there was still work to be done. Food was their obsession. They thought about it constantly, dreamed about it, talked about it during the long nights when sleep would not come. They ate whatever they could find or take. Wild fruits, roots, occasional chickens stolen from farms, sugarcane chewed until their jaws ached. Sometimes a sympathetic peasant would bring them rice or beans, and they would eat like men who had forgotten what fullness felt like, savoring every bite, knowing it might be days before the next meal. Hunger became their constant companion, a hollowness that never quite left, that taught them what the poor had always known, that the body can survive on almost nothing, but the spirit requires purpose to endure. The peasants were the key to everything. At first they were terrified, caught between the guerrillas who needed their help and the army that would kill them for providing it. Batista's soldiers treated the campesinas like enemies, burning their homes if they suspected collaboration, torturing them for information, raping their daughters as punishment or entertainment. The guerrillas, by contrast, treated them as allies. Fidel insisted on it, made it a rule that could not be broken. They paid fair prices for food, even when they had almost no money. They helped with harvests. They respected the women. They treated the peasants as equals, as human beings with dignity and rights. And slowly, gradually, the campesinas began to see that these men in the mountains were fighting for them, not just using them. Che understood the politics of this instinctively. He had traveled across South America, had seen how the poor were exploited and ignored, had learned that revolution could not succeed without popular support. So he made it his mission to win the peasants over, not through speeches, but through actions. He set up schools, teaching literacy to children and adults who had never been inside a classroom. He established medical clinics, treating infections and injuries and chronic illnesses that had gone untreated for years. He sat with the campesinos in their homes, listening to their stories, learning their names, understanding their struggles. And they, in turn, began to trust him. They brought food without being asked. They hid weapons for the guerrillas. They sent their sons to join the fight. And the revolution, which had seemed impossible, began to take root in the soil of the Sierra Maestra. But trust was not enough. The guerrillas needed discipline, organization, strategy. They needed to become an army, not just a band of survivors. And Che, who had studied military theory in Mexico, who had read Mao and Lenin and understood the principles of guerrilla warfare, became one of the revolution's most important architects. He organized training programs, teaching the new recruits how to shoot, how to move in formation, how to set ambushes, how to disappear into the jungle when the army came. He was a hard teacher, demanding perfection, tolerating no laziness or carelessness. Men who could not keep up were sent away. Men who endangered others through stupidity were punished. And men who deserted were hunted down. Because desertion was not just a personal failure, it was a betrayal of everyone who stayed and fought. He also learned to be ruthless in ways that troubled even Fidel. When the guerrillas captured enemy soldiers, Che interrogated them coldly, clinically, extracting information before deciding their fate. Some were released with warnings. Some were recruited to the revolutionary side. But some, especially those who had committed atrocities against peasants, were executed. Che believed that revolution required moral clarity, that certain crimes could not be forgiven, that justice sometimes demanded blood. He carried out executions himself, not delegating the hard work to others, believing that if he ordered death, he should be willing to deliver it. And each time, he wrote about it in his journal, analyzing his own feelings, noting the absence of guilt or hesitation, documenting his own transformation from healer to executioner. The war was not constant battle. Most days were spent waiting, preparing, moving, enduring. But when the fighting came, it was sudden and brutal. The guerrillas ambushed army patrols, stealing weapons and supplies, then melting back into the mountains before reinforcements could arrive. They raided small outposts, overwhelming the defenders through surprise and speed. They blew up bridges and communication lines, disrupting the army's ability to coordinate. And with each victory, no matter how small, their confidence grew. They were not just surviving anymore. They were winning. Che distinguished himself in these battles. He was fearless, almost recklessly so, often leading charges himself, exposing himself to enemy fire in ways that made his men nervous. Some thought he had a death wish, that he was trying to die heroically rather than live ordinarily. But it was not that. It was that he believed so completely in the revolution that his own life seemed like a small price to pay for its success. He had already given up his country, his family, his profession. What was one more sacrifice? What was his body compared to the liberation of millions? By mid-1957, the guerrillas numbered in the hundreds, and Fidel promoted Che to Comandante, giving him command of his own column. It was a remarkable rise for a foreigner, for someone who had arrived in Cuba less than a year before as just another soldier. But Che had earned it through competence, through discipline, through the absolute clarity of his commitment. His men followed him not because they loved him, he was too cold, too demanding for easy affection, but because they trusted him. They trusted that he would not waste their lives, that he would not ask them to do anything he would not do himself, that he cared more about victory than glory. And so Che Guevara, the boy who could not breathe, the doctor who wanted to heal, became Comandante Che, one of the most feared and respected leaders of the Cuban Revolution. The transformation was complete, and the mountains that had tested him, that had broken lesser men, had forged him into something new, something harder, something necessary, something that the world would never forget. Command changed him in ways that even he did not fully anticipate. It was one thing to be a soldier, to follow orders, to risk only your own life. It was another to be responsible for dozens of men, to make decisions that would send some of them to their deaths, to carry the weight of their survival on your shoulders. Che approached command the way he approached everything, with absolute seriousness, with discipline that bordered on severity, with a refusal to tolerate anything less than complete commitment. He believed that revolution was not a game, not an adventure, not a romantic gesture. It was war. And war required sacrifice, hardship, and a willingness to become something more than human, something colder, something capable of doing what needed to be done. His column became known for its discipline and its effectiveness. While other units sometimes grew lax during the long periods of waiting, Che's men trained constantly. They practiced marksmanship, they drilled formations, they studied the terrain until they could navigate it blindfolded. Che instituted strict rules: no stealing from peasants, no mistreatment of women, no waste of ammunition, no complaints. Men who broke these rules were punished swiftly, sometimes expelled from the column entirely, sent back down the mountain in disgrace. And men who showed cowardice in battle faced consequences that ranged from public shaming to execution, depending on the severity of their failure. Che believed that one weak link could destroy an entire unit, that discipline was not cruelty but necessity, that the revolution could not afford sentimentality. But he also cared for his men in ways that surprised them. He set up a field hospital within his column, using his medical training to treat the wounded, to perform surgeries with whatever tools they had, to save lives that would otherwise have been lost. He made sure his men ate before he did, took the smallest rations for himself, slept less than anyone else. He taught them to read and write during the quiet hours, believing that an educated revolutionary was more valuable than an ignorant one, that literacy was itself a form of liberation. And though he was demanding, though he rarely smiled or showed affection, his men came to respect him deeply. They knew he would never ask them to do something he had not already done. They knew he valued their lives, even if he was willing to spend them when necessary. And they knew that following him meant being part of something larger than themselves, something that might actually change the world. The war intensified throughout 1957. Batista, embarrassed by his failure to crush the rebels, sent more troops into the Sierra Maestra, better equipped, better trained, determined to finish what had started. The mountains became a battleground, with skirmishes erupting weekly, sometimes daily. The guerrillas learned to fight and fade, to hit the army hard and disappear before they could be surrounded, to use the terrain as a weapon. They set traps in the jungle paths. They ambushed supply convoys. They picked off soldiers who wandered too far from their units, and slowly the psychological balance shifted. The army, despite its size and firepower, began to fear the mountains. Soldiers deserted, morale crumbled, and the guerrillas, once hunted and desperate, became hunters themselves. Che led some of the most daring operations. In one raid, his column attacked an army garrison, overwhelming the defenders and capturing enough weapons to arm 50 new recruits. In another, they ambushed a convoy carrying supplies and ammunition, leaving the soldiers alive but taking everything they had. Che's reputation grew, not just among the revolutionaries, but among the enemy. Batista's soldiers spoke of him with a mixture of fear and respect. This Argentine commander who fought with a cold fury, who showed no mercy to those who harmed peasants, who seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost. The government offered rewards for his capture, dead or alive. His photograph circulated in military briefings, and yet he remained untouchable, moving through the mountains like smoke, always one step ahead. But the war was not just military. It was also political, psychological, a battle for the hearts of the Cuban people. Fidel understood this instinctively, and he established a radio station, Radio Rebelde, broadcasting from the mountains, telling the people that the revolution was alive, that Batista's days were numbered, that liberation was coming. Che contributed to the broadcasts sometimes, his voice calm and measured, explaining the goals of the revolution, calling on workers and students and peasants to join the struggle. And people listened. In Havana, in Santiago, in towns across Cuba, citizens gathered around radios to hear the voice from the mountains, to know that someone was fighting for them, that the dictatorship was not invincible. The urban resistance grew stronger, coordinated now with the guerrillas in the mountains. Students staged protests. Workers went on strike. Saboteurs blew up infrastructure. And Batista responded with increasing brutality, torturing suspected revolutionaries, disappearing dissidents, turning the cities into police states. But the violence backfired. Every atrocity committed by the regime created more revolutionaries, more people willing to risk everything to see Batista fall. The revolution was spreading beyond the mountains, becoming a national movement. And Che understood that this was how they would win, not through military dominance, but through moral authority, through showing the people that another way was possible. In the mountains, life remained harsh but purposeful. The guerrillas built camps that became small societies, with schools and hospitals and workshops where they repaired weapons and made uniforms. They published a newspaper, printed on a hand-cranked press, distributing it to peasant communities. They held political education sessions, teaching the fighters about imperialism and capitalism, about why they were fighting and what they hoped to build. Che was deeply involved in this ideological work, believing that a revolutionary without theory was just a soldier, that understanding the why was as important as knowing the how. He taught classes on Marxism, on the history of Latin American exploitation, on the mechanics of revolution. And the men, many of them barely literate when they joined, began to see themselves not just as fighters, but as agents of historical change. During this time, Che's relationship with Elida deepened. She moved between the mountains and the cities, carrying messages, coordinating with the urban underground, risking her life daily. When she was in the Sierra Maestra, she and Che spent what little free time they had together, talking late into the night about the future, about what Cuba could become, about whether the revolution would survive its own victory. Elida saw sides of Che that few others did: his occasional softness, his dry humor, his capacity for tenderness beneath the revolutionary hardness. She did not try to change him or soften him. She accepted who he was, what he had become, what he was willing to sacrifice. And he, in turn, found in her something he had not expected to find again, a partner who understood the totality of his commitment, who did not ask him to choose between love and revolution because she had made the same choice. By 1958, the tide was turning. The guerrillas controlled large sections of the Sierra Maestra. They had established liberated zones where peasants lived free from Batista's authority, where land was redistributed, where schools and clinics operated openly. The revolution was no longer just an insurgency. It was a parallel government, demonstrating through action what it promised in words. And Batista, desperate and losing, launched a massive offensive, sending thousands of troops into the mountains in one final attempt to crush the rebels. The offensive failed. The army, demoralized and poorly led, could not match the guerrillas' knowledge of the terrain or their commitment. Ambushes decimated entire battalions. Supply lines were cut. Soldiers surrendered or deserted in massive numbers. And when the offensive collapsed, the guerrillas went on the attack, pushing out of the mountains, moving toward the cities, carrying the revolution with them. Che was given command of one of the main columns, tasked with cutting the island in half, with capturing the central city of Santa Clara, with bringing the war to Batista's doorstep. He moved west with his column, marching through the countryside, growing his force as volunteers joined along the way. They fought skirmishes, liberated towns, destroyed infrastructure. And everywhere they went, the people welcomed them, feeding them, sheltering them, celebrating their arrival as if they were liberators rather than soldiers. Because that is what they were, liberators. And the people, who had suffered for so long under Batista's corruption and violence, saw in them the possibility of something better. Something just, something that belonged to them. The march to Santa Clara took months, but every step brought them closer to the end. Che's column was exhausted, undersupplied, outnumbered by the forces defending the city. But they had something the army did not. They had belief. They had momentum. They had the knowledge that history was on their side. And as they approached Santa Clara in late December 1958, as the final battle of the revolution loomed, Che stood at the front of his column, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his beret pulled low, his lungs burning with every breath. And he smiled, just slightly, because he knew. The end was near. Victory was within reach. And nothing, not even death, could stop them now. Santa Clara was not just a city, it was a symbol. It sat in the center of Cuba, a crossroads between the East and the West, between the mountains where the revolution had been born and Havana where Batista still clung to power. If Santa Clara fell, the island would be cut in two and the regime would collapse. Everyone knew this. Batista knew it. His generals knew it. And Che knew it. So the city was fortified, defended by thousands of soldiers, protected by tanks and artillery, supplied by an armored train carrying weapons and reinforcements. It should have been impregnable. It should have held. But Batista's army was already broken, not in body but in spirit, and spirit was everything. Che's column arrived at the outskirts of Santa Clara on December 28, 1958. They numbered perhaps 300 fighters, many of them teenagers, armed with rifles they had captured or homemade weapons that barely functioned. They were exhausted from the long march, hungry as always, low on ammunition. Against them stood an army 10 times their size, dug into defensive positions, backed by armor and air support. Any rational assessment would have said the attack was suicide. But Che had learned in the mountains that rationality was a luxury revolutionaries could not afford. What mattered was will. What mattered was conviction. What mattered was showing the people that the revolution could not be stopped. The battle began on December 29th. Che divided his forces, sending units to attack key positions throughout the city, keeping the army off balance, preventing them from concentrating their defense. The fighting was brutal, close-quarters urban warfare where every street corner was a battlefield, where snipers fired from windows and grenades exploded in narrow alleys. Che moved through it all, calm and focused, directing the assault, appearing wherever his men needed him most. He was hit by shrapnel at one point, a piece of metal tearing into his arm, but he barely paused to bandage it before continuing. Pain was irrelevant. Injury was irrelevant. Only victory mattered. The people of Santa Clara joined the fight. Students built barricades in the streets. Workers sabotaged power lines and communications. Women brought food and medical supplies to the rebels, risking their lives to support the attack. And slowly, block by block, building by building, the guerrillas pushed deeper into the city. Batista's soldiers, seeing the population turn against them, seeing the revolutionaries fight with a ferocity that outmatched their weapons, began to lose heart. Some surrendered. Some deserted. Some simply stopped fighting, waiting for the end they knew was coming. The decisive moment came at the armored train. Batista had sent it to reinforce the city, 22 cars carrying soldiers and weapons and ammunition. Everything the defenders needed to hold out. But Che had intelligence about the train's route, and he sent a team to destroy the tracks. On December 29th, the train derailed, its cars toppling and crashing, trapping the soldiers inside. Che's forces surrounded it immediately, firing into the metal cars, demanding surrender. The soldiers inside, terrified and disoriented, gave up without much resistance. And when the train was captured, when Che's men opened the cars and found enough weapons to arm hundreds more fighters, the balance shifted irrevocably. The revolution had won not just a battle but a turning point. By December 31st, Santa Clara had fallen. The last holdouts surrendered or fled. The city erupted in celebration, people pouring into the streets, embracing the guerrillas, weeping with joy and relief. Che stood in the central square, surrounded by his exhausted fighters, watching the people celebrate, and he felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Not happiness, exactly, but satisfaction. A sense that the impossible had been achieved, that the years of suffering and sacrifice had led to this moment. The city was free. The revolution was winning. And Batista, in Havana, was preparing to run. On January 1st, 1959, in the early hours of the morning, Fulgencio Batista fled Cuba. He took a plane to the Dominican Republic, abandoning his regime, abandoning his soldiers, saving only himself and whatever wealth he could carry. The news spread across the island like wildfire. The dictator was gone. The revolution had won. And in cities and towns throughout Cuba, people celebrated, dancing in the streets, tearing down statues of Batista, burning symbols of the old regime. 7 years of dictatorship had ended, and the men from the mountains, who had been hunted and starved and written off as dreamers, were now the liberators of a nation. Fidel ordered the revolutionary columns to converge on Havana. Che's forces moved west, passing through towns where people lined the roads to cheer them, to throw flowers, to reach out and touch these men who had seemed more myth than reality. Che rode in a jeep, his uniform filthy, his face gaunt and bearded, his eyes tired but alert. He did not smile much during the journey. He was already thinking ahead, already worrying about what came next. Winning the war was one thing. Building a revolution that could survive its own victory was another. And he knew that the hard work was only beginning. They entered Havana on January 8, 1959. The city was delirious with joy. Hundreds of thousands of people filling the streets, climbing on tanks, embracing soldiers, weeping and laughing and chanting. Fidel addressed the crowds from the presidential palace, speaking for hours, promising justice, promising change, promising that Cuba would finally belong to Cubans. And beside him, quiet and watchful, stood Che, the Argentine who had become Cuban through will and sacrifice, who had helped lead an impossible revolution to an impossible victory. But even in that moment of triumph, Che felt the weight of what was coming. The revolution had destroyed the old order. Now it had to build a new one, and building was harder than destroying. The enemies were not just external, the United States, which would never forgive Cuba for daring to free itself, but internal. There would be disagreements about direction, about speed, about how radical the changes should be. There would be opportunists who joined the revolution only after it won, who wanted power without having earned it. There would be mistakes, miscalculations, betrayals. And through it all, the revolution would have to prove that it was not just another change of masters, but a genuine transformation of society. Che understood this more clearly than most. He had studied revolutions, had seen how many of them failed or betrayed their own principles. He had seen Bolivia's revolution lose its edge, Guatemala's revolution get crushed. And he was determined that Cuba would be different, that they would go further, deeper, that they would not stop until the entire structure of exploitation had been dismantled. He knew this would make him enemies even among the revolutionaries. He knew it would require more sacrifice, more hardship, more years of struggle. But he had not fought for half measures. He had not endured the mountains just to replace one ruling class with another. The celebrations continued for days, but Che did not join them for long. He had work to do. He was appointed commander of La Cabana fortress in Havana, where he oversaw the revolutionary tribunals that judged the crimes of the old regime. It was grim work, hearing testimony about torture and murder, about villages burned and families destroyed. And Che, acting as judge and executioner, authorized hundreds of executions of those found guilty of war crimes. He did not flinch from this responsibility. He believed that justice required it, that the revolution could not move forward without first confronting the crimes of the past. His critics would call it a bloodbath, would paint him as a monster. But Che saw it as necessary, as the price of transformation, as the hard edge that separated true revolution from mere reform. And in the quiet moments, late at night when the fortress was still, and the executions were done, and the future stretched out uncertain and vast, Che sat alone in his office and wrote. He wrote about what they had achieved and what remained to be done. He wrote about the mistakes they had made and the lessons they had learned. He wrote about the nature of revolution, about how it required not just courage but clarity, not just passion but discipline. And he wrote about himself, about the boy who could not breathe, who had learned to survive in the thin air of mountains, who had transformed himself from healer into warrior, from observer into architect of change. The boy from Rosario was gone. The medical student was gone. Even Ernesto Guevara had faded into memory. Only Che remained. Comandante Che, the revolutionary, the symbol, the man who had helped free Cuba and who now faced the harder task of making sure that freedom meant something real, something lasting, something worth all the blood that had been spilled to achieve it. The mountains had forged him. The war had tested him. And now the peace, more dangerous and more complex than any battle, would reveal what he was truly made of. The night settled over Havana, quiet after days of celebration. And Che, sitting in the fortress where men had been tortured under the old regime, where justice was now being administered by the new one, looked out at the city and felt the weight of history pressing down on him. They had won. But the revolution, the real revolution, was only just beginning. Victory should have been enough. For most men, it would have been. They had fought impossible odds and won. They had toppled a dictator, liberated a nation, proven that a handful of believers could change the course of history. They could have rested, could have enjoyed the fruits of their struggle, could have settled into the comfortable positions that revolutions create for their heroes. But Che was not most men. He had not fought for comfort or power or glory. He had fought for an idea, a vision of a world remade, and Cuba's liberation was not the end of that vision. It was only the beginning. And beginnings, he understood, required even more sacrifice than endings. In those first months after victory, Havana was electric with possibility. The revolutionary government moved quickly, enacting reforms that had been discussed in the mountains, now made real through decree and law. They nationalized industries that had been owned by foreign corporations, taking back the sugar plantations and the oil refineries and the telephone companies. They redistributed land, giving plots to peasants who had worked for generations on soil they never owned. They built schools in remote villages, sent doctors to communities that had never seen medical care, guaranteed employment and housing and dignity to people who had been treated as expendable. And the people responded with jubilation, with gratitude, with a hope that felt almost dangerous in its intensity. Che was at the center of this transformation. Fidel appointed him to multiple positions: commander of La Cabana Fortress, director of the industrial department of the National Institute of Agrarian Reform, president of the National Bank of Cuba. It was an absurd amount of responsibility, especially for someone who had no formal training in economics or administration. But Che approached it with the same intensity he had brought to guerrilla warfare. He worked 18-hour days, slept on a cot in his office, ate whatever was brought to him without tasting it. He studied economic theory, read voraciously about central planning and industrialization, consulted with advisors while making it clear that the final decisions would be guided by revolutionary principles rather than capitalist logic. His time at the National Bank became legendary, almost mythical. There is a story, probably true, that when Fidel asked who among them was an economist, Che raised his hand. Later, someone asked him why, and he admitted he had thought Fidel asked who was a communist. Whether the story is accurate or not, it captures something essential about Che's willingness to take on any role the revolution required, his belief that commitment mattered more than credentials, his conviction that the old rules did not apply to those building a new world. He signed the currency with a simple Che, a signature that seemed to mock the formality of banking, that announced this was not business as usual, but revolution applied to finance. But the work exhausted him. Cuba was broke, its economy hollowed out by decades of exploitation, its infrastructure crumbling, its people desperate for the improvements the revolution had promised. And the United States, predictably, was tightening the noose. American corporations whose properties had been nationalized demanded compensation. American politicians called for intervention. The CIA began planning sabotage operations, supporting exile groups, laying the groundwork for what would become a long, grinding effort to destroy the revolution from within and without. Che saw it all coming. He had learned in Guatemala what the empire did to revolutions it could not control. And he knew Cuba would have to be prepared to defend itself, to endure isolation and hostility, to survive on willpower and ingenuity when the material support dried up. He also knew that Cuba could not stand alone. The revolution had to spread, had to become a continental movement, or it would be suffocated by the empire surrounding it. This belief became an obsession for Che, a conviction that shaped everything he did in the years after victory. He traveled throughout Latin America as Cuba's ambassador, meeting with leaders, speaking to crowds, arguing that revolution was not just Cuba's destiny, but the destiny of all oppressed peoples. He spoke with a passion that bordered on fervor, his eyes burning with certainty, his words cutting through the diplomatic niceties that usually govern such interactions. He did not come to negotiate or compromise. He came to inspire, to challenge, to plant seeds of revolution wherever he went. In April 1961, those seeds bore bitter fruit. A force of Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the CIA, invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, attempting to overthrow the revolutionary government and install a regime friendly to American interests. It was Guatemala all over again, the same playbook, the same arrogance. But this time the outcome was different. The Cuban people, armed and organized, fought back ferociously. Che commanded troops on the southern front, moving quickly to block any advance, coordinating with other units to surround and crush the invasion. Within 72 hours, it was over. The exiles surrendered or died, and the CIA's plan collapsed in humiliation. The victory was sweet, but it came with a cost. The United States, embarrassed and furious, doubled down on its efforts to destroy Cuba. The embargo tightened, cutting off trade, starving the island of resources. Sabotage operations increased, with CIA agents blowing up factories and sugar mills, poisoning crops, assassinating officials. And the threat of direct military invasion loomed constantly, a possibility that forced Cuba to militarize, to divert resources from building schools and hospitals to building defenses. Che understood the logic of it, understood that revolution had to be defended or it would be crushed. But it grieved him too, because every peso spent on weapons was a peso not spent on transforming society, on building the new world they had promised. During this time, his personal life shifted again. He divorced Hilda officially, a formality that recognized what had been true for years, that the marriage had ended the moment he sailed for Cuba, that there was no going back to the life they had briefly shared. And he married Elida, the woman who had fought beside him in the mountains, who understood what drove him, who did not ask him to be anything other than what he was. They had children together, a family that grew even as Che's commitment to the revolution pulled him away. He loved them in his way, but his love was abstract, distant, filtered through the lens of his greater purpose. He was building a world for them, but he could not be present in their daily lives. The revolution consumed him, demanded everything, left no room for the ordinary intimacy of fatherhood. By 1962, Che was growing frustrated with the pace of change. Cuba had achieved much, but he believed they were not going far enough, not moving fast enough. not challenging the fundamental structures of capitalism with enough radicalism. He pushed for rapid industrialization, for breaking Cuba's dependence on sugar exports, for creating a self-sufficient economy that could survive without relying on any foreign power. His plans were ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. The economy struggled under the weight of transformation, shortages became common, rationing was instituted. Critics, even within the revolutionary government, questioned whether Che's vision was practical, whether his idealism was blinding him to economic realities. But Che did not care about practicality in the way economists did. He cared about principles. He believed that revolution was not just about redistributing wealth, but about transforming human consciousness, about creating a new kind of person who worked not for personal gain, but for collective good. He called this person the new man, someone freed from the selfishness that capitalism cultivated, someone motivated by solidarity and love for humanity rather than greed. It was a beautiful vision, almost utopian, and it required sacrifice, discipline, a willingness to accept hardship in service of a greater goal. Che embodied this ideal himself, living simply, refusing privileges, working alongside laborers in the fields and factories on weekends. He called these voluntary work sessions, and he believed they were essential. That leaders had to show through example that no one was above the revolution, that everyone had to contribute. But the vision was hard to sustain. People were tired. They had fought a war, had endured an invasion, were now living under embargo and constant threat. They wanted relief, wanted to enjoy the fruits of victory, wanted lives that were not defined entirely by sacrifice. And Che, who had given everything and expected others to do the same, struggled to understand why commitment seemed to be waning, why the revolutionary fervor that had burned so bright in the mountains seemed to be cooling in the cities. He gave speeches about duty and solidarity, wrote essays about the dangers of complacency, pushed harder even as resistance to his pushing grew. He also grew disillusioned with the Soviet Union. Cuba had aligned with the Soviets out of necessity, needing their economic and military support to survive American aggression. But Che saw that the Soviets were not true revolutionaries, that they had become bureaucratic and conservative, more interested in maintaining power than in spreading revolution. He criticized them publicly, argued with their advisors, refused to soften his positions to maintain diplomatic harmony. He believed in revolution as a global project, as a moral imperative, and he could not accept the Soviet position that revolution should be cautious, incremental, subordinated to geopolitical calculations. And so, by 1964, Che found himself at a crossroads. He had helped build a revolution in Cuba, had given it everything he had. But Cuba was stabilizing, institutionalizing, becoming a state rather than a movement. And Che was not built for stability. He was built for struggle, for transformation, for the constant forward motion of revolution. He looked at the map of the world and saw suffering everywhere, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. He saw people living under the same oppression he had witnessed in his youth, and he could not accept that Cuba's revolution should be enough, that he should rest while others still suffered. The dreamer who could not stop was beginning to realize that stopping was not an option, that his revolution was not Cuba's alone, that his war was not over, that somewhere out there, beyond the shores of the island he had helped liberate, another struggle was waiting, another mountain, another impossibility. And he would have to go to it, because that was who he was. That was all he had ever been, a man in motion, a man who believed, a man who could not rest while the world remained unchanged. The decision to leave Cuba did not come suddenly. It grew in him like a second heartbeat, persistent and undeniable, through months of meetings and speeches and the slow grinding work of administration. Che had never been comfortable with stability, with the mundane tasks of running a government, with the compromises that politics required. He was a revolutionary, not a bureaucrat. And by 1964, he felt the walls closing in. Cuba needed him less than it once had. The revolution was institutionalized now, with structures and hierarchies and routines. And Che, who thrived in chaos and crisis, who needed the clarity that came from struggle, felt himself becoming obsolete. Or worse, comfortable. He began speaking more openly about internationalism, about the need to export revolution, to create 2, 3, many Vietnams that would overwhelm the empire, that would force the United States to fight on so many fronts it could not win on any of them. He argued that Cuba's revolution would never be secure as long as the rest of Latin America remained under imperial domination. That solidarity was not just moral but strategic, and he meant it not as theory but as practice. He wanted to go back out into the field, to fight again, to prove that revolution was possible anywhere people were willing to sacrifice for it. Fidel listened, understanding what Che was saying beneath the words. They had fought together, had trusted each other completely in the mountains. But they were different men with different visions. Fidel was a nationalist first, committed to Cuba's survival and sovereignty above all else. Che was an internationalist, committed to global revolution, even if it endangered Cuba. They argued late into the night in conversations no one else heard. Fidel worried that Che would become a martyr, that he would throw his life away in some doomed struggle. Che countered that life without purpose was already death, that he had not survived the Sierra Maestra just to grow old signing papers and attending ceremonies. In December 1964, Che traveled to the United Nations in New York to deliver a speech. He stood before the General Assembly, dressed in his olive green uniform, his beret in place, his face harder and thinner than it had been in the mountains. And he spoke with a fury that shocked even those who knew him. He condemned American imperialism, listed its crimes, called for the liberation of all oppressed peoples. He declared that Cuba would support revolutionary movements anywhere in the world, that they would not be intimidated by threats or embargoes. And he spoke about Vietnam, about the courage of people fighting against impossible odds, about how their struggle was everyone's struggle. The speech was defiant, uncompromising, brilliant, and it marked him clearly and publicly as a threat to the established order. After the United Nations, he traveled through Africa, visiting newly independent nations, meeting with liberation movements, offering Cuban support, weapons, training, fighters, to anyone willing to take up arms against colonialism. He went to Algeria, to Ghana, to Tanzania, to the Congo. And everywhere he saw the same pattern he had seen in Latin America. Independence that was not true independence. Governments that had changed hands but not changed systems. Poverty and exploitation rebranded as development. And he came to believe that Africa needed its own revolution, that it could not simply inherit the structures left by colonizers and expect freedom to follow. In April 1965, Che disappeared. One day he was in Cuba, the next he was gone, and no one would say where. Rumors spread that he had been executed, that he had defected, that he had gone mad and been locked away. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. He had gone to the Congo to fight alongside rebels trying to overthrow a government backed by Western powers. He took a small group of Cuban fighters with him, and they entered the jungle, just as they had once entered the Sierra Maestra, believing that will and discipline and revolutionary commitment could overcome any obstacle. But the Congo was not Cuba. The rebels there were divided, poorly organized, suspicious of foreign fighters. The terrain was unfamiliar, the diseases unfamiliar, the politics incomprehensibly complex. Che tried to impose the discipline that had worked in Cuba, but it did not take. The rebels did not trust him. They did not share his vision of total commitment. They fought when it suited them and melted away when it did not. And Che, frustrated and sick with dysentery and malaria, found himself reliving the worst days of the Sierra Maestra without the eventual victory that had justified those hardships. The Congo campaign was a disaster. After 7 months, Che was forced to withdraw, to admit failure, to leave without achieving anything meaningful. It was the first time in his revolutionary career that he had truly failed, and it shook him. He returned to Cuba secretly, broken and questioning, unsure what came next. He could not stay in Cuba. His departure had been too public, his absence too symbolic. To return permanently would raise questions, would undermine the mystique that had grown around his disappearance. But he also could not rest. The dream of continental revolution still burned in him, perhaps brighter now because of the failure in Africa, because he felt he had something to prove. So he turned his eyes back to Latin America, back to the continent that had made him, that had shown him what suffering looked like and what revolution required. He studied the geography, the politics, the revolutionary movements scattered across the region. And he settled on Bolivia. It sat in the heart of South America, bordering 5 countries. If revolution could take root there, it could spread outward, could ignite the entire continent. And Bolivia had a history of struggle. Its miners had fought for decades. Its indigenous majority had been oppressed for centuries. If anywhere could be the spark, Che believed it was Bolivia. He prepared meticulously, using the lessons from Cuba and the mistakes from the Congo. He studied Quechua, the indigenous language. He read Bolivian history. He made contact with the Communist Party there, seeking support, assuming they would help as Cuba's communists had helped Fidel. But the Bolivian communists were cautious, bureaucratic, skeptical of this Argentine revolutionary who wanted to wage guerrilla war on their territory without their full control. They promised support but delivered little. And Che, impatient and convinced of his own correctness, decided to proceed anyway. Before he left Cuba for the last time, he wrote letters to Fidel, thanking him for the years of comradeship, releasing Cuba from any obligation to him, making clear that his choice was his own. To his children, explaining why he could not be the father they deserved, why his duty to the world's oppressed had to come before his duty to them, asking them to understand even though he knew they might not. And to Elida, his wife, his partner, the woman who had known him in the mountains and in victory and now in this final departure. He wrote with a tenderness that rarely appeared in his other writings, but also with a finality that suggested he knew what was coming, that he understood this mission might be his last. In November 1966, Che entered Bolivia in disguise, his head shaved, his beard gone, his appearance so altered that even friends might not recognize him. He used a false passport, took a false name, traveled as a businessman, and he made his way to the remote region of Nancahuza, where jungle and mountains met. where he would try one more time to start a revolution, to prove that the dream was not dead, that liberation was still possible for those willing to fight for it. He recruited a small group of fighters, Cubans who had volunteered to follow him, and Bolivians who believed in his vision. They set up camps deep in the jungle, began training, began preparing for the long war they knew was coming. And Che, now 40 years old, his asthma worse than ever, his body worn down by decades of struggle, felt alive again. He was back in the mountains, back in the struggle, back where he belonged. The dreamer who could not stop had found one more dream to chase, one more mountain to climb, one more revolution to fight. And the world, which had wondered where Che Guevara had gone, which had speculated about his fate, was about to get its answer. He was exactly where he had always been, in the places others feared to go, fighting the fights others feared to fight, refusing, always refusing, to accept that the world could not be changed. The Bolivian jungle was nothing like the Sierra Maestra. Cuba's mountains had been green and alive, difficult but ultimately hospitable to those who learned their rhythms. Bolivia's wilderness was harsher, more indifferent, a landscape that seemed designed to break human will. The terrain shifted without warning from dense jungle to arid highlands, the temperatures swinging from scorching heat to bone-chilling cold. Water was scarce in some regions and poisonous in others. The altitude punished even the strongest lungs, and for Che, whose asthma had been a lifelong adversary, every breath was a negotiation with pain. The guerrilla force he assembled was small, perhaps 50 fighters at its peak, a mixture of Cubans who had followed him and Bolivian recruits who believed in his vision. But the Bolivians were harder to organize than he had expected. Many were young and idealistic, but lacked the discipline that had defined the Cuban Revolution. They complained about the hardships, about the endless marches through terrain that destroyed boots and bodies alike. And Che, who had no patience for weakness, who believed that revolution required total commitment, grew frustrated. He imposed the same harsh discipline he had used in Cuba, but it created resentment rather than solidarity. The men respected his courage but feared his coldness, his willingness to punish failure without mercy. The support he had been promised never materialized. The Bolivian Communist Party, which had initially expressed interest in his campaign, withdrew its backing, warning him that conditions were not right for armed struggle, that the peasants were not ready to join a revolution. Che ignored the warnings, convinced that action would create consciousness, that the presence of a guerrilla force would inspire the people to rise. But the peasants in the region where he operated were not like the campesinos of Cuba. They were isolated, deeply traditional, suspicious of outsiders. They spoke Quechua, not Spanish, and Che's limited knowledge of the language created barriers that never fully dissolved. When the guerrillas came asking for food or information, the peasants gave little, afraid of both the revolutionaries and the army that hunted them. The Bolivian military, with American advisors and American training, was more competent than Batista's forces had been. They learned quickly how to track guerrillas, how to cut off supply lines, how to use the terrain against the rebels. And they had informants everywhere, peasants who reported the guerrillas' movements out of fear or for small rewards. Che's column, which had hoped to remain hidden while building strength, found itself constantly discovered, constantly pursued, constantly forced to move before they were ready. The war that Che had envisioned as a slow buildup became a desperate struggle for survival almost immediately. The months ground on, each one harder than the last. The guerrillas ran low on food, on medicine, on ammunition. Che's asthma worsened in the altitude and the exertion, and his inhaler, which had saved him countless times, eventually ran out. He suffered attacks that left him gasping, unable to move, dependent on his men to carry him when he could not walk. His health deteriorated visibly. He grew gaunt, his face hollow, his movements slower. But he refused to quit, refused to acknowledge that the campaign might be failing, that perhaps Bolivia was not ready, that perhaps this time the dream would not be enough. He kept a diary throughout, writing in it each night when he could, documenting the march, the battles, the deaths of his comrades one by one. The entries grew shorter as conditions worsened, the handwriting more cramped, the tone more resigned. He wrote about mistakes made, about lessons that would matter if anyone survived to learn them. He wrote about the beauty of the landscape even as it killed them, about moments of camaraderie among the fighters, about the small victories that sustained them when larger victories proved impossible. And he wrote, occasionally, about doubt. Not doubt about the cause, never that, but doubt about whether this particular struggle in this particular place would end in anything but death. By mid-1967, the guerrilla force had been decimated. Ambush had killed some. Disease had claimed others. Desertion had thinned the ranks. Those who remained were starving, exhausted, losing hope even as Che insisted they push forward. The Bolivian army tightened its net, using helicopters and rangers trained by American Special Forces, coordinating their movements with a precision that left the guerrillas no room to rest or regroup. And Che, who had once been the hunter in Cuba's mountains, now found himself the hunted, moving through hostile territory with nowhere safe to go. On October 8, 1967, in a narrow ravine near the village of La Higuera, the end came. Che's column, reduced to fewer than 20 men, was surrounded by Bolivian soldiers. A firefight erupted, brief and brutal. Che's rifle was damaged, rendered useless. He was hit in the leg, unable to run. As soldiers closed in, he reportedly said, "Don't shoot. I am Che Guevara. I am worth more to you alive than dead." They captured him, bound him, carried him to a small schoolhouse in La Higuera, where he was held overnight. He spent his last night on earth in that schoolhouse, wounded and guarded, knowing what was coming. Soldiers and villagers came to look at him, to see if this exhausted, dirty man could really be the legendary Che Guevara, the revolutionary whose face had circled the globe. Some saw a hero brought low. Others saw a terrorist who had gotten what he deserved. Che himself remained calm, almost resigned. He had lived his entire adult life preparing for death, had accepted it as the price of revolution. And now that it had arrived, he did not plead or weep or rage. He simply waited. The orders came from the Bolivian government, likely coordinated with the CIA, which had hunted him for years. They wanted him dead, wanted the threat he represented eliminated, wanted to prove that revolution was not inevitable, that even legends could be killed. On October 9, 1967, a soldier named Mario Terran entered the schoolhouse. He was drunk, or nearly so, needing courage for what he had been ordered to do. He raised his rifle, aimed at Che's chest. And Che, looking at him with those dark, steady eyes that had stared down death before, said his final words, "Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." The bullets tore through him. Multiple shots, aimed to look like they had come in combat rather than execution, to create the fiction that he had died fighting. His body was displayed publicly, photographed, proof that the revolutionary was dead, that the dream was over. The Bolivian military celebrated. The CIA breathed easier. And around the world, people who had followed his journey, who had believed in what he represented, mourned. But death could not end what Che had become. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, but his image, that photograph of him in the beret, fierce and beautiful and uncompromising, became one of the most reproduced images in history. It appeared on posters and t-shirts, on walls in cities he had never visited, worn by people who might not know his full story but recognized in his face something they wanted to believe in. The man who had fought for revolution became a symbol of rebellion itself, of the refusal to accept injustice, of the belief that another world was possible. He had wanted to change everything. He had succeeded in changing some things. Cuba was free, though its revolution would struggle and compromise and survive in ways Che might not have recognized or approved. And across the world, his example inspired others to fight, to resist, to believe that the powerful were not invincible. Some of those inspired would build movements that mattered. Others would fail as he had failed in Bolivia. But all of them carried forward the idea that had driven him, that the world belonged to those brave enough to demand it, to fight for it, to sacrifice for it. The boy who could not breathe had breathed his last in a small schoolhouse in Bolivia, far from Argentina, far from Cuba, far from anyone who loved him. He died as he had lived, in struggle, refusing to quit, refusing to compromise, refusing to accept that the dream was impossible. And though his body was gone, though his revolution in Bolivia had failed, though he would never see his children grow up or his wife grow old, he had become what he always wanted to be. Not comfortable, not safe, not even victorious, but eternal. A ghost that would haunt the conscience of the world. A reminder that some people refuse to accept things as they are. A symbol of the stubborn, dangerous, beautiful belief that change is always possible for those willing to pay its price. And as the night settles over this story, as we let the image of Che fade into history and memory and myth, we are left with a question. Not whether he was right or wrong, not whether his methods were justified or his vision achievable, but whether the world still needs dreamers who cannot stop, whether it still needs people who refuse to be comfortable while others suffer, whether it still needs revolutionaries. The answer, perhaps, is as complicated as the man himself, but the question remains, and it will not let us rest